Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Envision My Ride Bus Priority Study virtual public meeting. Tonight's meeting is going to consist of a presentation followed by a Q&A session. And to start us off, I'd like to introduce our project manager, Bruce Jones.
Thank you, Jayla. Good evening, everyone. So as Jayla mentioned, my name is Bruce Jones, and I am the project manager over the Envision My Ride Bus Priority Study. I want to first start by saying thank you all for joining us tonight. We do apologize for having to reschedule this meeting. I'm glad you are able to join us. I do want to go over a few housekeeping items with you as well. So with this meeting, we will be streaming this via YouTube. So you will have access to this meeting if you're not able to stay for the full duration, or if you would like to come back at a later time. You can find the information on our CATS YouTube page. We will also have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions, we do encourage you to drop them in the chat on YouTube. You will need to be logged in either through your Gmail account or your YouTube account to leave a comment, but feel free to drop those in and then we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. So just to give you an overview of the agenda, so I'll give you kind of an overview of what Envision My Ride is in the bus priority study. And then we'll go into some of the system-wide improvements that we're recommending as a part of Envision My Ride in the bus priority study. In addition to that, we'll then focus on some of the types of delay that we face as it relates to speeding up service. We'll highlight some of the interventions that we'll be utilizing to help speed up service and make service more reliable for customers. We'll also detail some focus corridors that we've identified for additional spot level treatments. So we'll be making improvements, like I mentioned, to our network system-wide, but then we have focus improvements that we'll be making on specific corridors that we'll be looking at as a part of this study. And then also I'll be giving an overview of how you can get involved, as well as our online open house where you can leave comment and view the project materials as well. And then we'll have the live Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So to start, just to give you a high-level overview, so Envision My Ride and the bus priority study work hand in hand together. Envision My Ride serves as the planning initiative where we establish the foundation of the network. So a number of you may be familiar with Envision My Ride. So we've been working on this initiative for a number of years. And this serves as our system redesign. So we went out to the public and learned some key things as far as what you all would like as it relates to your bus network. And what we learned from the public is that you all wanted more service that's frequent. So increasing the number of routes that operate every 15 minutes or better. And then also creating more direct service where possible. So serving main corridors. And then also providing more crosstown connections. So moving away from that hub and spoke model that makes all of our bus stops come into uptown, and instead having crosstown connections outside of uptown where possible. And then in addition to that, increasing the connectivity between different modes, such as our light rail network and bus network as well. Now, as we get into the bus priority study, we're looking at how we can build capital improvements. And so the main things that we'll be focusing on is what can we do to help improve speed and reliability for our bus network. So making sure that buses come on time and that it's reliable for individuals as you travel to and from your destinations. We'll also be looking at how we can better improve connections, not only between other modes of transit, but then also other modes such as bike shares, and trails and greenways as well. And then last, but certainly not least, looking at how we can begin to make improvements to bus stops system-wide, so enhancing the level of amenities by offering things like shelters, off-board fare payment, and other things at the bus stop level as well. And so to give you an overview of the timeline, so we began some of the initial work with Envision My Ride back in 2018. This started with the opening of our light rail network in Northeast Charlotte in March of 2018. And so with that, we made some modifications to a number of our routes in Northeast Charlotte. In addition to that, we did some system-wide network improvements in October of that year as well, where we implemented additional crosstown connections and straightened out routes where possible. As we continued to implement some of the Envision My Ride goals, we then focused on frequency improvements in 2020. So we began increasing the number of routes that operate every 15 minutes or better. Pre-COVID, of course, but after COVID was implemented, we actually implemented additional frequency improvements on a number of routes, including Beatties Ford Road, Route 7, Central Avenue, Route 9, the Sprinter route to the airport, as well as Route 16 to South Tryon. And so as we continue to roll out the frequency improvements throughout the network, and then also some of the other connections such as crosstown service and additional routes, we're now focused on how can we improve reliability and speed, and then also improve the level of amenities that we have at our bus stops. And so that's where the bus priority study comes into play. And so we began some of the initial work back in spring of this year, where we presented some of the initial concepts of bus priority back in May of this year. And so we conducted a survey. We heard from the public about some of the values as it relates to the bus network. And we use that to establish goals and objectives for the project overall. And so now as we continue through our outreach, we're now at the process of identifying some of the initial corridors for focus level improvements, as well as system-wide improvements that we'll begin to make throughout the network. So the study itself is now in the middle of it. So as you can see on this chart here, we're now in the fall portion of outreach. We're looking to make some recommendations based on input that we'll receive during this round of outreach. And then we'll make final recommendations once we get into early next year, after we come back to you to present some of the initial concepts based on this round of feedback. And so before we get into the focus corridors, I want to first start by looking at some of the system-wide improvements that we'll be making. So in the map that you see here, all of these routes that are in blue are the future high-frequency bus routes. And so those are routes that will have 15-minute or better service as we continue to roll out some of the improvements to Envision My Ride. So these routes include, as I mentioned, South Tryon, Route 16, but then they also include corridors such as Providence Road, Route 14, Kings Drive, and then also Park Road, Statesville Avenue, Graham Street, and other corridors as well throughout Charlotte. And so with the corridors that you see on this map here, we'll be doing a number of improvements throughout, including bus stop improvements. So I'll have some examples as far as what we'll be looking at in terms of bus stop improvements, but we're rolling out what we're calling mobility hubs. And those are essentially improved ways so that we can connect individuals to and from not only transit lines, but also additional forms of mobility. And so that includes bike share, potential on-demand transit, and other concepts similar to that as well. And then also throughout the corridor, we'll be implementing what's known as signal priority. And so all these routes and throughout our network overall, we'll have the ability to communicate with the traffic signal on roadways that are managed by CDOT, or the Charlotte Department of Transportation. And so what that means is that if our buses are delayed at the intersection, they'll be able to communicate with the traffic signal so they can advance a green light and continue to and from their destinations. So those are some of the improvements that we're making system-wide. I do want to stress too that we are making additional improvements to focus corridors, but I wanted to highlight some of the improvements that we're making for the network overall. So to give you some examples as far as what those bus stop improvements will look like, we're rolling out things known as mobility hubs. And so we have a couple examples that I want to show you too, but the key concepts of these are that they are making the transfer experience easier for customers as they transfer between different modes. So not only from bus to bus, but also from potential rideshare programs such as Lyft or Uber. I mentioned too, making bicycle connections, and then also connecting to scooters where possible as well. And so some of the features of mobility hubs include, of course, enhanced shelters. And so we have a graphic here at the top of what that would look like. The dedicated space for bicycle racks, so you can store your bicycles, and then also dedicated space for scooters as well. And so the overall goal, as I mentioned, for the mobility hubs is to help us improve the connectivity, especially for the first mile, last mile connections that individuals make to access frequent routes. We have two examples. So that one was a mobility center, just to go back. And so this is similar to what you might see at some of our light rail stations, where we'll have dedicated space for buses to lay over. Additional examples include some of our community transit centers, such as the Rosa Parks Center on Beatty's Ford, or the Eastland Transit Center, and then a number of our park and ride locations as well. An extension of that is in also looking at how we can improve on-street transfer experiences for customers. And so we have concepts known as the Mobility Plaza. And so how this concept works is that we'll have 4 enhanced bus stops at each corner of the intersection. So what happens here, as you can see in this graphic, you have 2 intersecting bus routes. And so the concept here is you'll have 2 high-frequency bus routes that intersect. We'll have bus stops placed at the far side of each location. So that means the location after the bus clears the intersection. So that'll allow us to take advantage of the signal priority, as I mentioned. So we'll be able to communicate with the traffic signal, get the green light, we can clear the intersection and then pick up and drop off passengers at the bus stops on the far side. One of the key experiences or key improvements with this as well is also enhancing the pedestrian experience. So making sure that we have crosswalk improvements, wayfinding signage, and additional amenities so that we can help make the transfer experience as smooth as possible. And so I mentioned some of the improvements that we'll be making system-wide, but now as we get into the focus improvements that we've been making on specific corridors, I want to start by first looking at some of the types of bus delay that we face. And so one of the most common delay types that we face includes dwell delay. And so this is essentially the amount of time that it takes for us to pick up and drop off passengers at the bus stop. So it's the amount of time that it takes for the bus to pull up to the bus stop, for the bus to open the door, for passengers to get on and off, pay their fares, and et cetera. And so looking at how we can improve the boarding process and improve this overall concept so that we can help improve dwell time, or reduce dwell time, I should say, rather, so that we can improve travel times and get you to and from your destinations quicker as well. And so there's a number of things that are associated with dwell delay, as I mentioned, the amount of time it takes to pay fares. If you're traveling by bike and you're uploading or you're loading a bicycle on the front of the bus, the amount of time that it takes for you to find your seat, and then also the amount of time it takes for passengers to get on and off the bus as well. In addition to that, and this is where signal priority comes into play, we also face traffic delay. So like other vehicles on the street, of course, congestion is a growing issue. And so some of the delays that we face, of course, extended red lights, growing congestion at intersections. And so the ability to clear the intersection is something that we'll be looking at as a way to address some of the reliability issues that we face on some of our services. In addition to that, re-entry delay. And so typically when the bus picks up passengers, it pulls over to the curb. Sometimes, depending on the layout of the road, it has to yield in order to get back into traffic. And so this, of course, causes delay depending on the amount of cars that we have on the roadway. So looking at ways in which we can help improve re-entry delay. And so I went through some of those delay types, and now I want to go into some of the toolkits for how we can improve service on specific corridors. And so one of the most common ways that we can improve it, as I mentioned, is through signal priority. So as you can see on the image on the right, we have an example of signal priority. And so with the bus here, it pulls up to the intersection, it will communicate with the traffic signal, and then it either extends or advances the green light so it can clear the intersection and then pick up the passengers on the far side or after it clears the intersection. Building upon that, what you see in the image on the left is known as a queue jump. And so how this works is the bus has a dedicated space at the intersection. So it can be either its own lane or it can be a shared right turn lane. But how it works is once the bus pulls up to this specific intersection, a special signal will give the bus permission to continue to jump ahead of stalled traffic. So if it's in a shared right lane, that essentially means that the cars that are in that right lane will get a signal so that they can make their right turn. And then the bus would have a special signal so that it can jump ahead and clear traffic at the intersection. If it's in its own dedicated lane, it works where it pulls up to that spot, it'll get a special signal, and then it'll clear traffic by jumping ahead, while all other traffic and pedestrians will have either a red light or a do not cross symbol. In addition to that, one of the most common ways that we can help improve bus delay is making bus stop changes. So providing real-time information. And so if you aren't aware, we did recently release a new app that actually has real-time arrival information for our buses. So we do encourage you to check that out in the App Store with our app so that you can access that information as well. In addition to that, improving bus stop amenities by offering shelters at the bus stop, and then also potentially looking at off-board fare payment, which I'll get to in a second as well. Then also looking at bus stop consolidation where possible. So reducing the number of stops so that buses aren't stopping every block, but maybe they're stopping every 2 blocks. A trade-off with that, of course, is offering a greater level of amenities. So if you have to walk a further distance or a slightly further distance, you would have access to enhanced amenities such as seating and a shelter to help make your waiting experience as pleasant as possible as well. And then also implementing yield to bus rules so that we can safely enter traffic when picking up passengers at the curb as well. Some of the additional ways to deal with the yield to bus features is making inline bus stops. So of course, we can look at extending the curb out so that we don't have to jump into maybe a bike lane or a parking lane to pick up passengers. So extending the sidewalk out so it meets the area where the bus picks up passengers. That way it can make stops within the line or within the lane of traffic, and then it can continue to its destination. Another concept is looking at dedicated bus lanes where possible. So of course, those are dedicated lanes where you have transit vehicles that would have exclusive use of the lane. Sometimes they can be shared with bicycles or other vehicle types such as emergency service vehicles or school buses as well. And then in addition to that, looking at how we can make fare collection changes. So off-board fare payment is an option. And if any of you use our light rail stations, you're familiar with the ticket vending machines that you can purchase your ticket before you actually board the train or bus. So implementing a similar concept of some of our high ridership stops and mobility hubs. And then also looking at non-cash fare media as well. And so I did mention the real-time app, but then also if you download the same app, you have the ability actually currently to download tickets, and you can use that to actually show to the operator and board buses as well. And so that's a way that we can speed up that dwell time that we may face that increases travel time for individuals. And then last, but certainly not least, we have additional concepts known as all-door boarding. So similar to what we have on a light rail, making sure that we have boarding so that you can board at the front of the bus or the back of the bus. Of course, we would have to install appropriate technology so that we can collect fare at the back of the bus as well. But looking at additional features like that. And then also similar to light rail stations, level boarding. So having the bus boarding area at the same level so that we don't have to deploy the ramp, especially if individuals are boarding by wheelchair, or maybe if they have a stroller. This can help speed up the boarding process as well. And so I went through some of the toolkits and the types of delay. And so now we want to look at what corridors did we select for some of the initial focus treatments that I just mentioned. And so based on the survey that we actually released back in May and the input that we heard from you all, we developed a number of goals and objectives that helped us identify some of the initial corridors that we'll be looking at for some of those focus improvements. And so we heard from over 5,000 people with that initial survey that we released, and we learned a number of things in terms of what you prioritize when it comes to your bus network. So we heard that individuals wanted us to provide better access to and from jobs. Of course, making sure that bus service is reliable, so making sure that it's on time and on schedule. And then also providing better bus service to individuals who may not own a car or who rely on bus service to get to and from their destinations, their primary means of mobility. In addition to that, the most desired amenities includes real-time arrival information, and then also making sure that we offer a comfortable experience at the bus stop by providing seating in addition to that. And then in terms of the most important things for investments, we learned that individuals wanted service quality, and then also service that is accessible for individuals. And so with that, we developed a number of goals and objectives that we use to help identify some of the initial focus corridors. And so with that, we identified 4 overall goals and used a series of objectives to help us measure that. And so what we looked at, of course, is enhance access to opportunities. So looking at how we can improve access to grocery stores, healthcare facilities, pharmacies, medical facilities, educational opportunities, and then other resources as well. And then also looking at how we can improve access to jobs and employment types. And then also making sure that we provide service to individuals within a 10-minute walk as much as possible. And then also looking at where we can support planned growth, specifically as we begin to roll out some of the goals and objectives as identified in the Charlotte 2040 plan. We want to make sure that we're able to serve some of those areas, specifically with transit connections as well. Then also looking at how we can connect the priority network to other modes. So looking at the number of routes that we have currently in our service and then also in future service plans, looking at ridership overall, looking at service levels planned and then also future service levels, and then also looking at some of the corridors where we currently face delay issues, as we travel to and from some of the destinations that you're trying to access. And then also looking at how we can provide equitable service. So looking at affordable housing opportunities, looking at areas that were identified as high risk for displacement as identified in the Charlotte 2040 plan. And then also looking at areas that don't currently have access to personal vehicles. And then as we continue to look at some of the focus treatments, we'll also be looking at how we can offer resilient travel options. And so with that, we'll be looking at how we can extend our network services through on-demand service and microtransit services as well, which acts similar to what you will see with Lyft or Uber, only in a transit format, where you'll be able to request a specific ride to connect you to and from some of our high frequency service areas and mobility hubs. And so what we initially did with the analysis, so that map that I showed you before, the future high frequency routes. So we have 22 routes in total that we looked at. And so what we're looking at for the focus treatments is narrowing this list down to 6 corridors in total. And I do want to stress too that we're looking at 6 just because of the scope of this project. But the overall long-term goal is to develop a capital program that we can begin to roll out throughout additional corridors system-wide too. So want to stress too that the corridors that you see here tonight, those are the initial corridors that we've identified. But as we continue to identify capital improvements, we'll be looking at how we can make investments throughout the high frequency network as a whole. And so what we looked at based on the goals and objectives to narrow this list down, we looked at the number of connections. So that's connections to both bus routes and then also existing and future rail and streetcar lines. Looked at the number of routes on corridors. And then also we looked at ridership and equity metrics as well. And I mentioned the Charlotte 2040 plan equity metrics were a big factor in how we identified some of the focus corridors. And so with that 22 or list of 22 routes, we narrowed that down to 10 radial routes and 4 crosstown routes. And what I mean by radial routes, those are the routes that come into Uptown and serve the Charlotte Transportation Center. And then the crosstown routes are the routes that provide connections outside of Uptown. And so with that, we narrowed that list down to 10 radial routes, as I previously said. So that's including Central Avenue, Beatties Ford Road, Sprinter Airport on Wilkinson, Monroe Road, West Boulevard, Tuckasegee, Statesville, and Freedom Drive, just to name a few. And then we also looked at 4 crosstown routes, which include the Plaza or Route 3, Route 2, which runs on Ashley Road, and then also Remount, UNCC, Route 29, and then Route 39 Eastway. And so with this list of 10 radial routes and 4 crosstown routes, we looked at additional metrics to help us narrow this down to 6 initial corridors overall. That's the long-term goal of this study area. Or study, I should say. For this initial analysis, we did identify 3 corridors, and we'll be working to identify the 3 remaining corridors based on input received this round and additional metrics as well. And so just to give you an idea as far as what we're looking at, so we looked at access to essential services. And so that's including access to education opportunities, fresh food resources, and then also healthcare facilities. And as you can see here with this color-coded map, so routes that are a darker colored green, those are the routes that ranked favorably in this category. And then the routes with the lighter color ranked lower in this category. So as you can see, routes like Route 9, Central Avenue, Route 27, Monroe Road, Routes 2 and Route 3 rank pretty high in this category in terms of access to essential services. In addition to that, we looked at access to housing opportunities, specifically looking at how we can connect to affordable housing opportunities. Again, we see routes 9, 27, and 3 that stand out in this category. In addition to that, we looked at Route 16, Route 2, and Route 7, which had favorable scores in this category as well. We also looked at where we're currently facing bus delay. And so with this, we saw that we were facing a higher level of delay on corridors such as Route 2, which is Ashley Remount, Route 10, West Boulevard, and then also Sprinter on Wilkinson. In addition to that, we had corridors such as Central Avenue and Eastway Drive that also ranked pretty high in this category as well. We also looked at vulnerability to displacement using equity metrics as identified in the Charlotte 2040 plan. And so based on those metrics, the routes that ranked highly in this category include Route 34 and Freedom Drive, Route 8 Tuckasegee, and then also Route 2 Ashley Remount as well. In addition to that, we looked at access to employment. And so this is existing employment opportunities. And we saw that Route 16 ranked pretty high in this category on South Tryon. In addition to that, Route 10 on West Boulevard. And then again, Route 2 Ashley Remount. And then based on those initial analysis and indicators, we identified 3 initial corridors that we'll be looking at for focused treatments. And so those include Route 2 Ashley Road, Route 7 Beatties Ford Road, and Route 9 Central Avenue. And I do want to stress too that we are working to identify the additional 3 corridors for a total of 6. But as I mentioned earlier, I do want to stress again that the goal of this is to develop a capital program that we can begin to roll out throughout the network. And so these corridors were identified for focused treatments so that we can develop a capital program and analysis that we can begin to roll out on additional corridors as we begin to make additional improvements as well. And so based on the findings here, we saw that corridors, in terms of dwell delay, we began to do an additional analysis, I should say rather. And so what we began to look at is dwell delay. And as I mentioned too, this is the amount of time that it takes for us to pick up and drop off passengers. And so I realize that some of these images may be small as well. I do encourage you, I'll get to that here in a second, a couple of slides too, to visit our online open house where you can view larger images of this and then also see some of the additional slides that we presented earlier as well, if you'd like to take a look at that. And so with this image here, we see that we're facing dwell time specifically in locations on the outer portion of Central Avenue towards Albemarle Road. For Ashley Remount, it's more so in the segment that's closer to Scaly Bark Station and traveling up Tryon and Remount Road. And then also on Beatties Ford, it's more so the segment closer to the Rosa Parks Transit Center. We also looked at types of signal delay that we face on the corridor. And so with this, anything that you see in red indicates where we face a higher delay compared to other spots on the corridor. And so we began to look at those metrics as well. Again, similar conditions. We saw sort of on that mid-range on Route 7, Beatties Ford, closer to the transit center, or Rosa Parks Transit Center, we faced increased delay. And then similar on Central Avenue, it's more so on the outer portion on Albemarle Road, and then also towards Eastland Mall as well. And so to give you an idea as far as some of the treatment types that we'll be looking at for specific corridors, we took a closer look to identify how we can begin to apply some of the treatment types that were identified. So as part of that treatment toolbox, we began to look at what's appropriate for each corridor. So specifically for Ashley Remount, as I mentioned here, this is where we're facing delay currently based on some of the metrics that we've been using. And so looking at how we can begin to improve delay through a number of spot level treatments. And so what you see here on the graphic, based on the letter that you see here, it corresponds to what you see in the treatment toolbox. So for instance, on the segment that we're looking at closer between Wilkinson and Freedom Drive, we're recommending things like faster fare collection, transit signal priority, and then also exploring queue jumps where possible so that we can improve service. Similar on the portion on Remount Road between Wilkinson and Tryon, looking at where we can apply or implement faster fare collection, and then also techniques so that we can speed up the boarding process as well. Similar to that, we'll be looking at treatment types for Beatties Ford Road. So I mentioned the segment between the transit center and then also Sunset Road is where we experienced delay. So it's looking at potential treatment types that we can begin to apply to that corridor. So again, looking at faster fare collection, signal priority throughout the corridor, and then also level boarding where possible so that we can speed up the boarding process as passengers get on and off the bus. And then looking at Central Avenue, so potential treatment types that we'll be looking at for this include, of course, faster fare collection, specifically for the segment between 7th Street and the Plaza. We'll also be looking at how we can begin to implement transit signal priority throughout the corridor. In addition to that, looking at the segment between Sharon Amity and Eastway Drive, similar to that, faster fare collection where possible, best bus bulb out so that we can help with that dwell time as it relates to making the stops if we pull over to the curb. And then also queue jumps where possible. And then similarly for the segment between Eastland on Albemarle Road and the Lawyers Park and Ride, also looking at faster fare collection to signal priority and queue jumps where appropriate. And as I mentioned too, we will be showing this through our online open house, which I'll get to here in a second if you would like to take a look at this. We do encourage you to provide input to tell us if there's additional things that you would like us to take a look at, if there's other specific corridors that we should be focusing on. We do encourage you to provide that input on the online open house. And so just to give you a summary of some of the next steps, so we'll begin to develop some of the recommendations for additional corridors. So identifying the 3 remaining corridors that we'll be looking at for the study. In addition to that, we'll begin to refine some of the recommendations on the mobility hubs and mobility plazas that I mentioned, so that we'll be rolling out those improvements throughout the entire network. We want to make sure that we are strategic in where we place those locations so that we can help improve connectivity for individuals as they access some of the high frequency routes moving forward. And so some of the next steps too will begin to implement transit signal priority throughout the network, as I mentioned. So those are on all the roads that are managed by the Charlotte Department of Transportation. And then we'll also be considering new services to support the system. And so this includes on-demand and micro-transit service, and then also ways that we can help improve first mile, last mile connectivity to and from some of our high frequency transit lines, specifically at the neighborhood level. And so I do encourage you all, if you would like for us to get involved, we do encourage you if you have a neighborhood association or community group that you would like for us to attend to give a presentation, or if you'd like to ask more direct questions, we do encourage you to reach out to us. You can go to our website, ridetransit.org/envisionmyride for more information on how you can contact the project team. In addition to that, we do encourage you to visit the same website, ridetransit.org/envisionmyride. You'll find a link at the top to our online open house where you can browse through some of the content that I presented to you tonight, and then also provide input on some of the initial treatment types that we've identified for the corridors. We did hold a series of drop-in meetings at the Transit Center this past week. If you would like to view this presentation again or some of the materials that we presented, we do encourage you to, of course, come back to our YouTube page where this video will be made available. You can share that with your network as well. And then also, last but certainly not least, you can also send us an email at teltransit@charlottenc.gov with project-specific questions, and then we'll follow up with you accordingly on that. So I do want to first, before we go into the Q&A portion, so when you log onto our website, ridetransit.org/envisionmyride, what you'll see is a link to the online open house. And so you'll be directed to a site that looks like this. You will be encouraged to provide contact information. It's not required to access the site, but if you browse through the different rooms, you can see some of the initial materials that are presented to you tonight. So you can get an overview of the project. You can get an overview of some of the high-level improvements that we're making to the network overall, and then also some of the focus improvements that we'll be making in those specific corridors that I walked through tonight. So we do encourage you to log on to that website, browse through the open house, and provide input to us as well. And so with that, I will now open it up to any Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to Jayla.
Thank you for that presentation, Bruce. So we'll get into our Q&A portion of the meeting. So the first question we have, can you reiterate what is the future plan to address the other routes not referenced in tonight's presentation?
Yes, so we'll continue to make improvements throughout the network. And so that includes bus stop improvements. So making sure that we implement things like additional shelters and amenity types throughout the network, but then also looking at how we can take advantage of signal priority. And so I mentioned that all of the roads that are maintained by CDOT will have the ability to communicate with traffic signals. So if we're running behind schedule, that will advance or extend a green light so that we can help get back some of that time that we may be missing. And so that's one of the things that we'll be looking at. In terms of the crosstown improvements, so as we begin to roll out some of the mobility hubs, what we'll be looking at is how can we better connect crosstown connections to and from those hubs. And so that's what you'll be seeing on routes like 51 on Pineville, Matthews Road, and additional crosstown connections as well. But then also extending upon that, looking at how we could begin to roll out some of those on-demand and micro-transit solutions so that we can improve first mile, last mile connections, specifically to neighborhoods that are close to high frequency routes, but it may not be an easily accessible route for pedestrians to access. So looking at how we can offer on-demand solutions known as microtransit, but better connect individuals to and from some of the routes. But then also looking at how we can serve areas that currently don't have fixed route transit service and how we can better connect individuals to and from some of our high frequency routes, specifically at the end of the line as well.
Thank you. And you actually covered another question, which was to expand upon the crosstown routes. So you actually got right into that. Another question we have is, will the new park and ride lots in the Charlotte area be looked into for later future projects?
Yeah, so as we continue to identify some of the mobility hub improvements, we'll be looking at how we can build upon some of our park and rides by incorporating additional features. So of course, we'll be looking at the park and rides such as the North Met community. And I do want to stress too, if you are interested in some of the ongoing initiatives with North Met, we do have an upcoming public meeting. I'm not sure the exact date, but I do know it's next week. So you can get more information on the North Corridor BRT plans and the park and rides in that area. But to answer your original question, yes, we'll be looking at how we can expand and enhance some of the features and amenities at our existing park and rides, specifically as it relates to looking at if off-board fare payment is appropriate, how can we offer enhanced amenities such as shelters and things of that sort, and then also potential charging locations if you have an electric vehicle, dedicated areas for microtransit and on-demand services. So we'll be looking at concepts like that moving forward.
Thank you. And if you were referencing the Metro Rapid, the North Corridor, that meeting is actually the 18th at 5:30. So you can find more info at ridetransit.org, where you can find all of our information. Another question we have is, could CATS join or team up with local shopping centers and make park and ride lots where adjusting bus stops already are on north, south, east, and west sides of town?
Yeah, so we currently do have a number of agreements with shopping centers. Sometimes we'll form agreements with churches. So we have done that in the past, and that's something that we typically aren't shy about doing. So I think it just depends on the location of the area, if it would make a good park and ride. Typically, if we have an express route that serves the area, we're looking at park and ride so that we can better serve commuters that travel to and from those destinations. But then also looking at other things like if we, particularly if we're going through a rezoning process, sometimes we'll require as a part of that, if it's a major shopping destination and it's on an express route, we'll require them to set aside a number of spaces as a part of their agreement so that we can have a park and ride location. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's just on a case-by-case basis, but we do have some existing agreements with shopping centers. And so we'll continue to look at that strategically to see if there's other locations that we need to identify for park and ride locations moving forward.
Thank you. And another question we have is, can CATS look into redirecting the Belmont after it leaves the Lynx Sugar Creek station to serve the bus stop at Raleigh and Greensboro streets so workers in the area can be served with bus needs?
Yes, so we do have a bus stop that goes in one direction. I don't believe the 4 serves that. We'll have to take a deeper look with our safety and security team just to make sure. I think that we looked at that before and there was potential issues with the bus making the turn onto Raleigh, but that's something that we can definitely take a look at again, determine the possibility for that.
Thank you very much. And it's looking like right now that is the last question of the night. Oh, no, it is not. When will bus stop changes or consolidations begin? would they occur first on the 3 identified priority corridors?
Once we finalize some of the recommendations, we'll have a better idea as far as time frame for that. Some of these improvements, we're looking at initially a 3 to 5 year capital program that we're trying to invest in. It's hard to say at this exact moment when that would occur, but I do encourage you to definitely stay in touch with the project team and stay in touch with some of our outreach. So we should have more clarity on a time frame for that towards the end of the study, once we have some of the initial recommendations finalized.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna give it a second, but it is looking like there are no more questions. So I just want to thank everybody again for coming out and joining this virtual meeting tonight. As Bruce said, all of the information can be accessed on the Envision My Ride website and on our virtual open house. You can find all this information on ridetransit.org. And with that, I just want to say thank you, Bruce, for your presentation, and have a good night.